One of the effective tools in politics that has been used really throughout political history, even in ancient Rome, in their government, is the ability to connect with people, or what we would say in modern politics, the ability to connect with voters. And so much of a politician getting elected or not is dependent on them doing that well. It has been a tried and true strategy, and that makes sense. The people you're wanting to vote for you want them to connect with you, your message, your personality. And throughout political history, both modern and ancient history, some have done this particularly well, and others it has backfired woefully. As a student of political history, not speaking maybe with his personality or his political persuasion, depending on what you think, very few have done this as effective, in my opinion, as Donald Trump, particularly in leading up to the 2016 campaign. He enacted what became known as Trump rallies. The average attendees at a Trump rally was 13,000 people. Some waited for days to get into his rally, and all you really had was a guy in a suit standing up at a podium for 90 minutes on average without a script, talking, and the crowd eating it up. Sometimes he'd invite a commoner on stage and they would talk. And again, not speaking about his political persuasions and policies, we've been there, done that. I have never seen that done as effectively in all my life. Even politicians who couldn't stand him secretly envied his capacity to hold an audience. And even now, some political experts believe one of the reasons he lost is he was unable to go out on his rallies during COVID and duplicate the same sort of crowds. I'll let you debate that at lunch if that's true or not, but that's actually being bandied about. I'll probably never see anything like it again in my life. The absolute charisma of connecting with an audience, he had the it factor. And here a guy, a multimillionaire celebrity who lives in a house with literally a gold ceiling, could connect with iron workers and farmers, veterans and steel workers. He did absolutely, as a politician, connect with common people. He is not the first to do it, although I would say he's the best at it. In the 1992 presidential campaign, you remember there are 3 nominees running at the time. George H.W. Bush, who's president, Texas tycoon, independent Ross Perot, and the comeback kid who was losing in that campaign, and really the only president to win the presidency and actually have less than a 50% popular vote is Bill Clinton. In the 1992 campaign, Bill Clinton was losing up until the second presidential debate. It was a town hall debate where 3 guys sat at a stool and they took questions from common people from the audience. Not quite spontaneous, as you know, but nevertheless political theater. And during that campaign, it's now famous, there was an African-American single mother who asked a question about economics. She was living in impoverishment. The first question was to the president. He answered, then to Ross Perot. When candidate Bill Clinton was asked the question, he did something that no one has ever done before in political theater. He got up from his stool, he took the handheld mic, and he walked to the lady asking the question. He got with just in a few feet of her, he repeated her name back to her and said, "I feel your pain." And he then didn't begin to rattle off policies. He began to talk about his own story of growing up in Hope, Arkansas, and having a single mom raise him. And it connected. And his poll numbers grew, and he won the election as a man of the people. So those are some examples where it was effective. There's also equal examples where politicians tried to connect with the people and had disastrous results. one of the most infamous that now becomes a Google byword is 1988 Democrat candidate Michael Dukakis, Massachusetts senator who ran against George H.W. Bush. He was being pummeled in the polls of being anti-crime, anti-war, or pro-crime, anti-war candidate. So he decided he would do a photo op. You might remember this. He gets in a tank, he puts on an army helmet, and he looks stern at the camera in kind of the Uncle Sam pose. But the image backfired. Number one, because Michael Dukakis was a short man, so coming out of a tank, he looked like Tattoo off of Fantasy Island. And he was wearing a helmet literally 2 sizes too big, so he comes across like Beetle Bailey. And in fact, you can Google Beetle Bailey Dukakis, and this picture will come up. More recently, in 2004, John Kerry made a huge blunder that cost him his campaign when he tried woefully to connect with Midwesterners. He was losing in the polls among people in the Midwest because they believed he was an erudite Easterner, elite, snobbish, that couldn't connect with ordinary people. He was also seen to be loose on crime and not tough on national defense. And so he was particularly being hammered that summer by the NRA. So he decided that in opening day season of hunting season in Iowa, he would fly in from his mansion in Massachusetts, not accidentally, with 30 press corps taking pictures of him at 5 in the morning going to a hunting license place in Podunk, Iowa. He was dressed in hunter orange camo. We learn later, a first in his life. He applies for a hunting license, again, a first in his life. And you can actually get the video. He goes up and says in a sort of Midwest slang, "Can I get me here a hunting license?" And it backfired. Midwesterners weren't dumber than a box of rocks and feel that he was pandering to them to get a vote. We could go on and on with this sort of thing. In all of the connections, politicians understand they have to connect with the people to get them on their side. And in 2 Samuel 15, we have a master politician who doesn't believe a word what he says, but he's only doing it to get the people behind him so he can take the throne from his father David. It's Absalom, who our storyteller continues to push him to the forefront. So there are 2 contrasting characters. One that is very popular, the other that actually has to retreat from a city that he founded. And then we find lessons to this story, particularly if we pivot to David, of what does God do for his children when they're in bad times. So let's look at Mr. Israel, politician Absalom. We see two clear characteristics of a politician here. First, he clearly has insincere connections. He wants to connect with every citizen in Jerusalem. Remember, he's back in the capital city after being gone for 3 years in exile because of the whole dastardly deed of the murder of Amnon. David reconciles, that was a foolish decision, brings the fox back in the henhouse, brings him back to the capital city, and here we have him spinning his yarn for several years, plotting a coup to take over the kingdom. And he's got to have the people to do it. With as much bling-bling posse that would make any modern hip-hop artist be in envy, Absalom shows up in downtown Jerusalem at the courthouse steps armed with horses and chariots and servants. It is a clear PR campaign to say, look at me. I'm Mr. It. And if you want things done, you better know me. And so every day he's calling attention by bringing in this parade to downtown Jerusalem at the courthouse steps. The second thing he does is he doesn't simply want to get noticed. He wants the people's vote. So, the text tells us that bright and early every morning, he shows up at the courthouse steps. There's a long line of people waiting to get in, to get an ear to the king, to tell him all sorts of cases. Criminal cases, civil disputes, they all have to go through the royal courts because David, as part of his job description, is judge of all Israel. But it's log-jammed. And so there's Absalom, not in the palace, but down there with the people, rubbing shoulders. We can see him listening intently to every complaint, talking to every citizen that comes the far and wide, the rich and the poor, nodding his head in approval as they utter their grievance. Solomon at this point has never met a plaintiff with whom he did not agree. In fact, he listens, but then he pivots toward his own grievance. Yes, Joe Bob, I understand. You know, you have a legitimate case. You're being robbed by the government. Bunch of red tape. You know, they've taken advantage of you and all these good citizens like you. The problem is you're not going to get in today. You don't have a hearing. No one's going to represent you. The king's too busy. The system's too log-jammed. There's too much red tape. I'm sorry. If I were king, I'd listen to your case. I'd listen to all your cases, no matter how big or small, but you're not going to be heard today. In fact, Solomon has a nice touch here in the text. He actually dispenses with the custom that all Israel would do to a crown prince. When someone would see a crown prince on the street, they would stop and bow. He's the heir apparent to Israel. But Solomon here stops that. He just takes a handshake and a pat on the back from the honor. He's just an honest Joe. He's like one of the people. When the palace cohorts would come down and say, Solomon, tea and caviar and escargot is served. No. Me and the boys are going down to Mickey D's and get a Big Mac and fries. That's how Solomon operated. A man of the people. He against the establishment. An outsider. Who is he? He's just the crown prince of Israel. But he's an outsider, wink, wink, trying to convince the people that he's for them. It all is a bunch of smoke and mirrors. But it worked. Verse 6 tells us, Absalom duped the men of Israel. Literally, the text here is, Absalom stole the hearts away from the men of Israel. Now, the phrase does not mean stealing affections so much as duping the mind. You've ever heard the cliche, pull the wool over one's eyes, where they're thinking blindly? That's what Solomon's charm did to all Israel. He's got them right where he wants them. Now, if insincere connections didn't work, the second tactic of a crooked politician, and that's what I call strong-armed manipulations, right? This is the backroom deal where a politician says, look, I'm going to get your vote. No, you're not going to get my vote. I'm going to get it. I've got a couple of pictures of you in compromising situations, and you're going to vote for me. Okay, I'm voting for you, this sort of thing. And Absalom does this. Now, he's been planning this for a long time, and he goes to his gullible dad, who's the real problem. You know, if David was any sort of father, Absalom probably would have turned out differently. But here we get a good example. You get Absaloms when you're not a good parent, right? And Absalom hits David in a weakness. He knows his dad's weaknesses. And one of his dad's weaknesses, many of them, but it's a good one, is David loves the worship of God. He's a man after God's own heart, and Absalom uses this to get what he wants. He comes to his dad and says, look, Pop, you know, I need to go worship God down in Hebron. I made a promise to God that if we were going to reconcile, I was going to praise Him for His forgiveness and I would go down and offer sacrifices. I haven't done that. Would you allow me to go? And for the first time in the biblical record, the Absalom-David narrative, for the first time, David is not suspicious of Absalom. Every other time up till now, when Absalom has a request, David is hesitant to give it because he smells that Absalom is not quite on the up and up. But here, David gives it without a fight. Maybe Absalom has turned over a new leaf. Maybe after the 628th time of deceiving me, 629 will do it. But David doesn't put up a fight, and that's all Absalom needs. He has a coup waiting for him in Hebron. He has been building up an army to go against David's national army. It's in the backwoods of Hebron. He comes down, and Absalom, here's what I mean by strong arm manipulation. He brings 200 noblemen from Jerusalem. They're probably the wealthiest guys, or they're the most influential. He needs their resources. He brings them down, the text tells us. They are completely in the dark of the coup. They think they're coming down to worship God. But when they get there, Absalom says, on my signal, I want all these coup armies to shout, Absalom's king of Hebron, which is a translation, a revolution's coming because we're going to march on Jerusalem. When that happens, of course, these noblemen are shocked. And Absalom now has got them in a trap. Guilty by association. You're down here. When we announced we're going to do a rebellion, that's treason to be a part of this. Now, they didn't know they were going to be a part of it, but he's got them between a rock and a hard place. They go back home. They were a part of this. So now he's forcing them into submission. Now, think about that. This spoiled brat can't get any friends unless he fakes it, i.e. being the good politician, or he forces it through manipulation. Contrast that to our next character, David. We learn David hears about this public announcement of revolt. And then he orders a flight. Verse 14, get up, let's flee. There will be no escape for us from Absalom. Hurry and go, lest he hurry and overtake us and scatter disaster on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. Now, from a human perspective, at least in my mind, this is rather sad. Here goes David again on the run. He spent 10 years of his life on the run. Both times where he's fleeing, it has to do with his kingship. And he's on the run, in flight. And remember, David, on record, he's never lost a battle on the field. He's Israel's greatest warrior. He defeated Jerusalem and took it for the first time in Israelite hands, and he extended Israel, the greatest in her history, beyond its borders. He is Israel's greatest king. And here we have him, a king running from the capital he founded. Now, David isn't stupid. He knows that Absalom has got him on numbers, that if he fought him in battle now, he'd lose. Absalom's had years to build up an army secretly, so David needs time. And David resorts back to the warfare he knew when he was running from Saul. Run, hit and run, guerrilla warfare. So he marches outside the royal city, down past the Kindred Valley. And the text says toward the desert, which implies, as we see later, toward the Mount of Olives, a route that will be replayed by another king that will come into Jerusalem with weeping and with wailing. So it is during this time now that there are lessons I think our storyteller wants to teach us through this character contrast of David. And perhaps, though not being duplicated, you also, as God's child, are going through bad times. This lesson is just because you're king and a man after God's own heart and have been forgiven of sin doesn't mean that you still don't go through trials. There are two primary lessons, I think, God gives His people that we should be reminded during bad times. Number one, God gives His people in bad times the gift of people, sometimes coming in unlikely places. A bulk of this story is about people who come out of the woodwork to encourage David that you wouldn't think. As David is leaving the city, he doesn't have to deceive anyone to like him like his spoiled brat son does. Nor does he have to bully or cajole anyone to like him. He is leaving the city. He is like a whipped hound, defeated, exiling. He's like the French in World War II, leaving Paris as an open city because they know they can't defeat the Nazis and they don't want to get bombed. David doesn't want Jerusalem to be sacked and sieged, so he leaves the city open for Absalom to walk in without firing a shot. This is a total act of humiliation by Israel's greatest warrior. As he's leaving, the text says that people file past him. And he files past the country, and everyone weeps. Which tells us where the people's hearts really are. They're weeping that their king is leaving the royal city that he founded. Notice the type of people that stop to give him support. It is not an accident, I don't think, the historian gives us a bunch of foreigners and pagans. And there's one particular figure that is rather interesting that strikes up a conversation with David. His name is Ittai. He's a mercenary from Philistia. He's actually from Gath. Now, what do we know of Gath and David? I mean, he's public enemy number one there. And yet God brings this guy in David's life. He hadn't even met David for 24 hours. He hasn't been in the city for a day. And Ittai is one of the citizens leaving in exile with David on the run. David is impressed and confused by this and actually stops him and says, "Why are you going with us? Go back and stay with the king, for you're a foreigner and an exile from your own home. You only came to me yesterday, and will I today make you wander about with us, since I don't know where I'm going? Go back, take your brothers with you, and may the Lord show you steadfast love and faithfulness to you." Here's what David is saying. Well, you're under no compulsion to follow me. Don't you understand? You have nothing to gain to follow me. You've got everything to lose. You don't have to share in this disaster. But Ittai will have none of it. Notice what he says. "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king will be, whether for life or death, there will your servant be." Notice Ittai uses a double oath to spike his point of where his loyalties lie. "Come what be, David, ride or die, hell or high water, death or life, I'm rising and going down with you." That's a definition of a friend. A lot of us have a lot of fair weather friends, right? When we're popular, when the sun is shining, when everything's good, the dental plan works, the health is okay, all the kids are playing together. It's great. Everyone can do that. But give yourself a trial, and you'll see who your friends are. Isn't it an interesting contrast? David's kith and kin, his own blood, a son that he's known his entire life is now his worst enemy. But a guy he just met yesterday becomes a faithful friend. One guy he gave forgiveness and kindness and resources and everything, now betrays him. The other he gives nothing to, and the guy says, "I'm with you, ride or die, I'm here." That's a friend, and it comes in the most unlikely places. And brothers and sisters, sometimes you and I have been the recipients of such. We've been in a trial, it's been dark, our fair weather friends are nowhere around because we're on hard times. But then out of nowhere comes somebody. Maybe it comes in the form of an email, a card, a kind deed, a small gesture. But we all have ties. Look, in this world where there is fake friendships, getting a faithful friend is like finding two moons in our sky. Hang on to them, because they're rare. Ittai is to David in the Old Testament what Onesiphorus was to Paul in the New, a doggedly faithful friend in times of need. Paul says this about Onesiphorus when he says, "He often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains." Paul will go on to say that everyone deserted me. I was under house arrest for 3 years. I couldn't get out of my house without military guards. I was washed up has-been. No one had to want to know Paul, but Onesiphorus came and refreshed my spirit. Not only is this guy a friend to David, but if we read on in this story, we find that the official clergy throw their support to David, not to Absalom. Here we have the presence of Zadok and Abiathar, they're the priests, along with the entire tribe of Levi. And they show their support to David by not only being willing to go in exile with him, but they, in a wonderful act of symbolism, bring the Ark of the Covenant for the first time out of Jerusalem to join the exile parade of David. Now, don't let you miss that if you're a Jew. That's a big deal. The Ark of the Covenant symbolizes God's presence. What they're saying is Absalom can have the popularity, he can have the city, but he will not have the presence of God. They bring this out to show their allegiance to David. Now he's got foreigners as his friends, and he's got all of the clergy as his friends. But David will have none of it. And here we find another gift that God often brings in our lives in the bad times. Not only friends, or people rather, but also providence. Perhaps the speech that holds this whole story together is mentioned by David here in verse 25 and 26. Where David says to the priest, "Thanks but no thanks, carry the ark back into the city." Now notice, we all struggle with God's sovereignty and human responsibility. Here's one of these clashes here. But David doesn't bother. He doesn't fight with it. He lives in it, as we all should. "If I have found favor in the eyes of the Lord, He will bring me back and let me see both it and its dwelling place. But if God says, 'I have no pleasure in you,' here am I, let Him do to me what seems good to Him." Notice what David is doing. First, he will not repeat the same mistakes that Israel did in 1 Samuel. Do you remember that? No, it's been a while. What happened in 1 Samuel 4 in relationship to the Ark of the Covenant and fighting battles? Do you remember? Israel had sort of fallen into a pagan trap that a piece of furniture could sort of, just by being on the battlefield, zap their enemies, like the last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? So if they just brought out the Ark of the Covenant, God's enemies would fall. God said, this is idolatry, this is paganism, I'm not a piece of furniture. And so the Ark was captured. David is not going to make that same mistake. No, this is a piece of furniture. I leave the piece of furniture in Jerusalem, I want the presence and favor of God. And so what does David do here? He recognizes this whole mess may be my fault. Nathan said it to me back in chapter 12 with my sin of Bathsheba, that my house would be unsettled, they would fight against me, and this may be God's final judgment with that sin, and if it is, I'm willing. Maybe Absalom is a tool from God to use me as the final condemnation of my sin against him. David says this. So there's the human responsibility side. But he draws back and he says, but if God is with me, if His favor is on me, then I'm going to come back to Jerusalem. I'm going to worship before this ark again. He'll find favor. He'll protect me. He'll bless me. And what does David do? He absolutely rests in God's sovereignty. Brothers and sisters, I have said it before, I'll say it again. From this pulpit, I say it to myself. If you're anxious about things in the world, if you're in a dark place, a bad trial, lay your head on the pillow of God's sovereignty. You'll sleep good. This is what David is doing. The other thing he does that's very important is he doesn't use this doctrinal position. He's a historical theologian here, right? He doesn't want to repeat the same mistakes as Israel early, but he relies on God's sovereignty. But that doesn't mean that he's going to do nothing. A lot of people will do this, God's sovereignty. Why even evangelize? If God's going to save and he's not, why evangelize? Well, maybe because you ought to be obedient to the Bible. David is a man who absolutely plunges himself on God's sovereignty, but in the very next verse is a man of action. He doesn't say, I believe God can protect me, so therefore I'm going to play hopscotch on I-435. No. He absolutely believes God's going to protect me, but he's a man who uses his mind not in spite of his mind. And the very next phrase, he says, are you a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your 2 sons. See, I will wait at the fords of the wilderness until the word comes from you in order to inform me. So he is a man of action, planning, organizing, not doing nothing simply because he relies on God's sovereignty. Here is providence. The next act of providence we see is that David, just when you don't think your day can get any worse, it does. Have you ever had those days? Right? I mean, your life's like a bad country music song backwards 12 times. I mean, just when you think it can't get any worse, it does. It's one of these days for David. Okay, he's being exiled out of the city. He's just heard his son is a traitor. He's got to give up the city he founded. He doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't even know if he's going to win. He may be killed. He doesn't know. And then he gets word that the Michael Jordan of political advisors, Ahithophel, has defected and went over to Absalom's side. Now, the story doesn't tell us the characteristics of Ahithophel here. We have to wait till later. But let me cheat a little bit so you understand how this would have been a gut punch to David. We're told in chapter 16 that Ahithophel is a very sharp counselor, so sharp, the text tells us in chapter 16, he had no competition. Literally, he had no peers. And we are told in chapter 16 that success oozed from his advice. So any advice he gave, success followed, right? Okay, so, hey man, invest in Berkshire Hathaway. You're going to double your money. Okay, and your money's doubled, right? Hey man, go do this. That's Ahithophel. Add to this a personal sting. We find out that Ahithophel is the grandpa of Bathsheba. So now we got another gut punch that a family member, another one, has left your good graces and betrayed you. Nothing in the text tells us what conversation David and Bathsheba would have had about this, but nevertheless, this is a bad day for David. In fact, ever had one of these days where you can understand the prayer? I mean, sometimes the best, that's why I can never compute these all-night prayer, these prayer vigils that go for hours and hours. How in the world, how do you pray that way? I don't talk to normal people that way, go on and on for hours. Some of the best prayers are short and sweet and to the point. David is so exasperated. He prays a quick prayer, and here it is in verse 31. Please make Ahithophel's counsel foolish, O Yahweh. There it is, right? Just make it terrible. No sooner had David prayed this than he gets an answer from his prayer. Not in the way he thought. He gets an answer in the form of 2 feet, torn clothes, and dirty hair. Hushai the Archite. And apparently, David understands this is an answer to prayer. Because he says to Hushai, if you go on with me, you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in the time past, so now I will be your servant. Then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel. Hushai would be needed more than just friendship. He would be needed for espionage. God does this sometimes. we pray and His providence often comes in unexpected ways. 99% of our prayers involve what? God's answers involve what, how, when. Back in February, this is a little thing to you. It's one of these reminders of providence to me. But back in February, I had some furnace problems. Tim and Ralph could attest to this because, they're my heroes. They can do things I would live to be 100 and never be able to do. And they gave up a lot of hours of their life to look at my furnace. In God's providence, it went kaput the week we had sub-zero temperatures, right? So I'm up all night trying to recharge it, get it to where it's livable. And Ralph and Tim, bless their hearts, they tried, they MacGyvered it. And Tim put me in touch with a friend of his named Tom. Tom is a heating and cooling guy. And he came out, said, I think I know what it is, and if it is, it's going to cost you a lot of money. It's your motherboard's going out. But I think let's kind of monkey wrench a few things and get you to the springtime. And he came out again, and he fixed it, it broke. Finally he said, it's your motherboard. Got to replace it. The day it died we had negative 15 degrees. It was that night, February, right? And he comes out, it was on a Saturday in February. Gets me a new motherboard. Says, well, Tom, what do I owe you? He says, that'll be $300, which I got off pretty good for motherboards. But still, $300 is, I got kids, right? And I said, Lord, that money was to be used for something else, but thank God it's fixed. I praise you, and you're a good God. That was Saturday evening. I show up here to church the next day, and after service, a couple who has never met Tom before, would not know anything of my situation, handed me an envelope. I opened the envelope, and it had 3 $100 bills in it. Now, I'm not saying that happens to me every day, because I'd be praying a certain way every day if that could. But it's a good lesson in God's providence. You see, we have what prayers, and the answers are what, when, and how. David prays, God, will you confound Ahithophel? And he's probably thinking, give him a stroke, make him have a chariot wreck on Jerusalem and Hebrew and highway. Little did he know that a guy with ash in his hair by the name of Hushai would come calling. But that's God's providence, you see. And finally, we have David writing a psalm as he does, and as we close, I'd like to take you to that psalm. David lets us know what his heart is during this event. As he often does, he pens a hymn, a poem, and it later becomes a psalm. When you read Psalm 3, this is David leaving Jerusalem after hearing his son has defected, after hearing his best counselor has left him, after hearing the popular crowd like his son, after thinking he may never come back. He's had a bad day. On that bad day, he wrote Psalm 3. So let me read it and hear what David, the comforter, can comfort you. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I don't want to take the time for the sermon, but the imagery is profound. Everyone is telling David, there's no hope for you. You're surrounded. You don't have any friends. You're outnumbered. Your days are numbered. And he says, using his warrior image, I've got a shield, big shield I can hide behind her, and God is my shield, covering me. You ever had a bad day? And you need a friend to buck you up? Chin up. What does the House of Windsor say? Keep a stiff upper lip, even when you're having a bad day. Here, God is his friend. And he lifts his head up. Chin up, David. I'm with you. Chin up, David. It'll be okay. I'm your shield. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept, and I woke again. Ooh. You have a bad day and a bad trial. Sleep doesn't come easy, probably. David says, I got a good night of sleep. Why? Why? Do you see it? It's very important you see it. Why did he sleep? Because the circumstances didn't change. Still got a son out there wanting to kill him. He slept because the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people. That is not hyperbole. That's really going on. Who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek and you break the teeth of the wicked. This is profound. He's talking about his son. Salvation belongs to the Lord, your blessing on your people. Centuries later, there will become another son of David. He will also walk out of Jerusalem, go down the Kindred Valley up to the Mount of Olives, there to the Garden of Gethsemane where he will pray, because he will have many, many enemies against him. And he will go back into Jerusalem all alone, to fight those battles. Believing his Father will be the lifter of his head, and there he will, because of our sin, eventually on that battle cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's how bad things got. Down the trail of the Via Dolorosa, there was nothing but weeping and sobbing at a failed king who died on the cross for us and fought the greatest battle. And yet said, it is finished. And 3 days later, he rose from the dead and conquered all of his enemies. And as David wrote in Psalm 3, our Lord could say, because of us, all of our enemies have been scattered to the wind. Good people, chin up. The Lord your God is with you. Salvation belongs only to our God. And he has given that as a blessing to his people. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for these people and their patience, their love for you. Thank you of the many gifts you give us in this life full of torment. Thank you most of all for your Son, Jesus, who gave us life and life eternal. This we pray in Jesus' name and for your sake. Amen.